Hello, my dear friends. If you think the lives of medieval kings were all about grand feasts, fancy ceremonies, and the day-to-day business of ruling, you might want to pull the covers up a little tighter tonight. We're often shown the gold and the velvet, the polished crowns, and the high castle walls. But we're about to look past all that, into the deep shadows of the royal bedchamber, where the real stories were written. The history we learn in books is a carefully curated one. We're told the stories of kings and queens, of battles won and kingdoms built. But we're not told everything. Hidden from the official records are the bizarre rituals, the strange and deeply held beliefs, and the dark family secrets that were quietly accepted and passed off as sacred royal tradition. You have to understand, the absolute power these monarchs held was unlike anything we know today. It didn't just let them rule over lands and people, it let them create their own private universe with its own set of rules. In this world, their strangest and most disturbing desires could be reframed as sacred duties, and there was no one with the power or the courage to question them. So tonight, let's get comfortable and dim the lights together. Let the noise of the modern world fade away as we step back in time. We're going to open a door that was locked for centuries and uncover the hidden side of royalty, revealing a story that is far more shocking, strange, and unsettlingly human than you can imagine. When you picture royal medicine, it's easy to imagine something gentle. You probably think of prayers being whispered in a chapel, or a court physician mixing up some herbs gathered from the castle garden. But when a truly terrifying illness struck the palace, especially one that threatened the king himself, the cures became desperate, disturbing, and deeply strange. There's a persistent story from that era, a dark piece of folklore about what happened when a king fell ill with a disease we now believe was syphilis. His desperate doctors, fumbling in the dark for a cure, would sometimes offer a shocking prescription. They told the king he must lie with a virgin, based on the magical belief that her untouched purity could act like a sponge, literally pulling the sickness out of his royal body and into hers. Now, to be clear, this virgin cure wasn't something you'd find in any official medical book. It was a superstition, a piece of dark folklore born from the absolute terror that swept across Europe when syphilis, known then as the Great Pox, first appeared. The disease was horrifying, incurable, and shameful, and in that fear, people were willing to believe in anything, no matter how twisted. The real, documented treatments for the disease were arguably even more horrifying than the folklore. They were based on the completely wrong idea of balancing the body's four humors, a flawed medical theory that had been around for centuries. The doctors of the time were truly working in the dark, and their methods were nothing short of brutal. For syphilis, the number one treatment was mercury. Patients were smothered in thick, silvery mercury ointments, or worse, forced to sit in heated boxes, breathing in toxic mercury vapor until they sweated profusely. The whole ordeal was so agonizing and destructive that it gave rise to a grim, well-known saying, "One night with Venus, a lifetime with Mercury." This mercury cure was, in reality, a slow-acting poison that ravaged the body. It caused a patient's teeth to loosen and fall out, their kidneys to fail, and their joints to ache constantly. Over time, it caused severe neurological damage, often driving a person mad long before the disease itself could kill them. Because of a king's absolute power, it was always the most vulnerable who paid the price for these superstitions. Poor girls from peasant families were the primary targets for the virgin cure. Court officials would go to their homes and make an offer their parents couldn't refuse, a payment of grain, tools, or fabric in exchange for their daughter, who was told she had been chosen to help the royal family. These young girls were treated as nothing more than disposable medicine, a tool to be used and then discarded. If the king's health didn't improve after a few nights, the girl was considered a failure. She would be quietly thrown out of the palace, often with a few coins and a warning to never speak of what happened, and a new girl would be brought in to take her place. And if you think being born a princess made you safe from this kind of bodily control, you'd be wrong. In fact, it was often worse. While a peasant girl's body was a temporary tool, a king's own daughter was a permanent political object, and her entire value to the kingdom was often tied directly to the state of her virginity. Before she could be married off to a foreign prince to seal a political alliance, a princess often had to submit to a cold and humiliating physical inspection. In a quiet room, surrounded by older women from the court, her future and the fate of her kingdom could be decided by what a royal midwife's fingers might find. It was a terrifying ordeal where her body was put on trial. This wasn't just a story, we have a famous historical example. In the 1450s, a princess named Blanche Sicru of Navarre was married to King Henry IV of Castile. After 13 years of marriage, an official inspection was ordered, and it proved that she was, remarkably, still a virgin. The reason given for the annulment was pure court politics. They couldn't dare suggest the king was impotent, so they invented a more convenient excuse. The official ruling claimed that malignant spell, a form of witchcraft, was preventing the king from consummating the marriage, allowing them to end an unwanted political union without blaming the man. The whole process was incredibly invasive and based on a complete misunderstanding of the female body. The examiners were looking for an intact hymen, believing it was the only true sign of virginity. They had no idea that it could be broken through innocent activities like riding a horse, or that some women are simply born without one. To them, the physical proof was all that mattered. Another bizarre custom designed to prove a bride's purity was the bloody sheet ceremony. The morning after the wedding night, the bed sheets were sometimes brought out and displayed to the court or the family as evidence that the marriage had been consummated and the bride had been a virgin. Her most intimate moment was turned into a public verdict. The pressure on these young women was almost unimaginable. Some resorted to desperate, dangerous tricks to protect themselves. A princess might meet with a trusted lady in waiting to devise a plan, smuggling a small, hidden bladder of animal blood or a piece of sponge soaked in dye into the bedchamber to fake the proof of her virginity. And what happened if a princess failed the inspection or if there was no blood on the sheets? The consequences were terrifying and absolute. The marriage alliance could be called off. She could be banished to a convent for the rest of her life, or in the most extreme cases, she might be quietly poisoned or executed to erase the shame she had brought upon her family. This obsession with pure bloodlines and political purity didn't stop at inspecting young women. In fact, that was just the beginning. It led directly to one of the most destructive and taboo practices in all of royal history, something that happened not in secret, but was planned and celebrated as a matter of state policy incest. In the cold calculus of royal power, marrying an outsider was a risk. A new family could bring new ambitions, new claims to land, and new rivals to the throne. To keep power, land, and wealth safely consolidated within their own hands, marriages between first cousins, uncles and nieces, and even half-siblings were not just tolerated, they were actively encouraged and arranged from birth. The most infamous and well-documented example of this was the Habsburg dynasty, a powerful family that ruled vast parts of Europe for centuries. For them, inbreeding wasn't an accident, it was a political strategy. They systematically married relatives for generation after generation, weaving their family tree into a tight, tangled, and ultimately doomed knot. The grim results of this strategy were literally written on their faces. The famous Habsburg jaw was a severe and often painful facial deformity where the lower jaw grew much faster than the upper one, making it difficult to speak or chew. But the problems went far deeper than that, leading to a host of other health issues, physical disabilities, and heartbreakingly high rates of infant mortality. The tragic endpoint of this long genetic experiment was King Charles Tuxer of Spain. He was the last of the Spanish Habsburgs, a deeply unwell and unfortunate man who was born with a host of physical and mental disabilities. He couldn't chew his own food properly, he barely learned to speak, and he was completely incapable of running a kingdom, a sad and broken final chapter for a once mighty dynasty. When Charles finally died, the autopsy performed on his body revealed a shocking medical horror story. The report described a man whose body was a wreck of genetic failures. It noted that his heart was the size of a peppercorn, his lungs were corroded, his intestines were rotten, and he possessed only a single, blackened, atrophied testicle. He was the living embodiment of his family's destructive tradition. Now, you might be wondering how any of this was allowed, especially in a deeply religious society. None of these marriages would have been possible without the official blessing of the Catholic Church. For the right price, or for the right political favor, the Pope would grant a special dispensation, which was essentially a holy permission slip giving the royals a pass to break the sacred rules of incest that applied to everyone else. And this wasn't just a strange habit of European royals. If we look back to the Ptolemaic dynasty in ancient Egypt, the family of the famous Cleopatra, we see the same thing, but taken to an even greater extreme. They practiced direct sibling marriage for centuries, believing it kept their bloodline divine, and their grasp on power absolute. Just try to imagine being a child in one of these families for a moment. The boy you played with in the castle gardens wasn't just your cousin, he was your future husband. The girl you grew up with as a sister might one day be your wife. Love was never part of the equation, and you had no choice. Your life was mapped out for you, and your duty was to the bloodline, no matter the personal cost. Their family trees became so confusingly tangled that they looked more like a dense web than a tree with branches. And so, behind the stiff, formal smiles we see in their royal portraits, there was a grim and often painful reality. It was a world of chronic illness, genetic disease, and a profound, quiet unhappiness that echoed through the palace halls for generations. Sometimes, a king's obsession went far beyond the cold politics of marriage and crossed over into the darkness beyond the grave. There are chilling stories from the medieval world of kings who refused to let their wives go, even after they had taken their last breath. It's in these moments that we see a monarch's grief twist into something far stranger. The most famous and haunting of these tales is the story of Pedro I of Portugal and his murdered lover, Inês de Castro. Their story is a true epic, a tragic mix of forbidden love, brutal court politics, and a king's undying, obsessive grief that would eventually defy the very boundary between life and death. Here's what we know is historically true. Inês was brutally murdered by nobles who disapproved of her influence over Pedro. When Pedro finally became king, his first act was to hunt down and execute her killers, but his revenge wasn't complete. Consumed by grief, he then had Inês's body dug up from her grave and publicly declared that she was, and always had been, his lawful wife and posthumous queen. He then had 2 magnificent royal tombs built for them in the Alcabasa monastery, placing them foot to foot. The reason for this, he said, was so that on Judgment Day, the first thing they would each see upon rising would be the face of their beloved. It was an incredibly extreme act of love and defiance against the court that had taken her from him. But there is a much darker legend that has grown around this true story. The myth says that Pedro placed her decaying corpse on the throne, dressed in royal robes, and forced all the nobles of his court to kneel and kiss her skeletal hand. This detail, however, is pure folklore. It was added to the story more than 100 years later by storytellers who wanted to make a shocking tale even more unforgettable. So, while the tale of the corpse queen on the throne isn't technically true, the real documented story is just as haunting in its own way. It shows how a king's immense and all-consuming grief could lead him to defy every norm of his society, turning his personal tragedy into a bizarre and spectacular national legend that is still told to this day. Now, not all royal sexual practices were a dark and hidden secret. Sometimes they were a very public performance, but probably not in the way you're thinking. The popular idea of kings performing some kind of pagan fertility ritual in front of a cheering audience is most likely a mix-up of what really happened, which was somehow even more awkward. What really took place was a strange but formal ceremony called the public bedding, or the culture as it was known in France. This wasn't a wild party, it was a bizarre but very real and very important part of a royal wedding night, and it had a very specific and very serious purpose. The purpose of the public bedding wasn't to please the gods, it was to please the lawyers. In an age where marriages could be easily annulled by claiming they were never consummated, a royal couple needed official witnesses. So, a crowd of high-ranking nobles and clergy would have to watch the couple get into bed together to legally confirm that the marriage was official and binding. You can just imagine the scene. A priest would bless the marriage bed, and then the nervous young couple, often practically strangers, would have to get into bed in front of a room full of powerful people. The witnesses would only leave once the heavy bed curtains were drawn. It was a formal, deeply uncomfortable ceremony to ensure that the political business of the day was properly sealed. The belief that the king's physical body was magically tied to the health of the land is an ancient one. It goes all the way back to pre-Christian ideas of sacred kingship, where a strong, vital king meant good harvests, healthy livestock, and a prosperous kingdom. The public bedding ceremony, as strange as it was really just a faint, formal echo of those much older and more direct fertility rites from a forgotten time. But as for the wilder claims you sometimes hear, like the idea that medieval kings performed public masturbation rituals to prove their strength, that seems to be a complete fabrication for this time and place. Those stories belong to other cultures and other eras, like the creation myths of the Egyptian god Atum or the defiant street philosophy of the ancient Greek Diogenes, who was known for doing shocking things in public to make a point. While the men of the court were busy with their public ceremonies and legal rituals, the royal women were often practicing their own, much quieter, form of power. Behind closed doors, in the flickering candlelight of their private chambers, they weren't relying on laws or witnesses. They were turning to the hidden world of folk magic and secret potions to get what they wanted. One of the most common and whispered about beliefs was that a woman could magically bind a man to her, ensuring his love and loyalty forever. The method was as simple as it was shocking. She would secretly feed him a single drop of her own menstrual blood, usually hidden in a dark cup of wine or a thick, heavy stew where it would go completely unnoticed. The strange logic behind this came from the ancient idea that this blood contained a woman's very life force, her spiritual essence. By having a man unknowingly consume it, she believed she was tying his thoughts and his desires directly to her. In a world that gave noble women very little real control, this was a secret, magical way of holding on to the one thing that secured her position, her husband's affection. Now, while we have no official court document proving that a specific queen actually did this, the belief itself was very, very real. This wasn't just some peasant superstition. It was a desperate and dangerous kind of magic that was passed down in whispers, from a mother to her daughter on the eve of her wedding, or from an old midwife to a young queen worried about a wandering king. And it was incredibly risky. This wasn't a harmless good luck charm. If a woman was ever caught practicing this kind of magic, she could easily be accused of witchcraft by her enemies at court. And in that paranoid and superstitious age, a charge of witchcraft was a death sentence. It was a terrifying gamble for a little bit of power. Beyond these secret spells, there were also secret parties. After a grand royal banquet had ended and the last of the wine cups had been cleared away, a select group of high-ranking guests might get a quiet signal from the king. They would be discreetly led away from the main hall, down hidden corridors, to where the real and much darker celebration was just beginning. These were organized orgies, held in secret rooms that were built into the palace architecture specifically for this purpose. These chambers were a world away from the formal court, filled with soft cushions, heavy incense, and slaves who had been meticulously chosen to match the known sexual preferences of the powerful guests who were expected to attend. For the slaves, there was absolutely no choice in the matter. They were treated like living decorations, sometimes dressed in elaborate costumes or painted with exotic designs. They were trained from a young age to perform and to please, and they knew that if they failed to satisfy a nobleman's whim, they could be brutally punished later, far from the eyes of the court. But it wasn't just about raw pleasure for the nobles either. Participating in these secret events was often a political test. It was a way to show your absolute loyalty to the king, to prove that you were part of his innermost circle of trust. To refuse the king's hospitality could be seen as an insult, a sign that you were too proud or disloyal, and could easily get you cut off from power. In some courts, the practice became even more disturbing. There are accounts of young royals, sometimes even the king's own daughters, being brought into these rooms as a twisted kind of coming-of-age ceremony. It was a horrifying ritual that blurred the lines between a secret celebration and a carefully orchestrated system of abuse. And the next morning, it was as if absolutely nothing had happened. Everyone would put on their formal clothes and their polite, practiced smiles. They would return to the business of the court, all of them bound by an unspoken code of silence. The dark secrets of the night were simply locked away until the next feast. This abuse of power took on many different forms, but they all stemmed from the same core belief that the king's body was sacred and therefore his desires were law. One of the stranger ideas was that a king could literally pass on his vitality or his seed of strength through the act of sex itself. In practice, this was little more than a justification for ritualized rape. A servant or slave girl would be chosen for the supposed honor of sleeping with the king. She was bathed and brought to his chambers, and it was made very clear that this was an order, not an invitation. Her body was seen as a vessel, a temporary container for the king's sacred power. If the girl became pregnant from this forced encounter, her terrifying ordeal wasn't over. In fact, it had just entered a new and even more dangerous phase. She would be watched closely for months, and her life, along with the life of her unborn child, now depended entirely on the baby's gender. If the child was a boy, the ritual was deemed a success. The mother might be quietly sent away with a small reward, never to see her son again, while the boy was raised by others within the palace walls. But if she gave birth to a daughter, it was seen as a complete failure, and the punishment could be severe. Both the mother and her baby girl might be banished or, in some cases, simply disappear from the records forever. In a strange, twisted mirror image of this practice, some royal traditions held that the queen needed the opposite. It was believed that a queen, surrounded by the overly refined and stagnant energy of the court, needed to be grounded. To do this, she had to absorb the raw, earthly energy of a commoner to maintain her spiritual balance and her fertility. This belief led to a highly secretive ritual where the queen would have sex with a hand-picked palace guard. The man was always chosen for his youth and strength, and to maintain absolute secrecy, he was always blindfolded, ensuring he could never truly claim to have seen the queen's face. The act was performed in total silence, a cold and impersonal transfer of energy. After the ritual was over, the guard was a dangerous liability. He knew too much. To ensure his permanent silence, he was usually sworn to secrecy through threats or promises of gold, and then immediately shipped off to serve at a distant, often dangerous, military outpost, never to be seen at court again. He was, in every sense of the word, a disposable tool. Sometimes, royals didn't need a formal ritual or a spiritual excuse to abuse their power, they just needed a change of clothes. In the daylight, a king was a figure of immense ceremony, surrounded by guards and advisors. But at night, some of them would shed their silks and velvets, putting on the simple wool tunic of a palace guard or servant to roam the sleeping castle corridors as a ghost in their own home. This disguise was a key that unlocked every door. It allowed them to approach a serving maid or even a high-born nobler woman without the pomp and ceremony that usually surrounded them. This wasn't about finding a connection, it was a twisted game of power and predation. In the darkness, dressed as a nobody, the king could take whatever, and whoever, he wanted. Pretending to be a simple guard didn't make them less powerful. In fact, it made them far more dangerous. A woman might resist the advances of a servant, but the game would end the moment the king chose to reveal himself. A flash of a royal signet ring or a whispered name was all it took. In that instant, any hope of resistance would vanish, and what might have been a simple assault became a royal command that could not be refused. And it wasn't just the men who played this game. Some queens, feeling utterly trapped and suffocated in their gilded cages, would play it in reverse. Constantly watched, judged, and controlled, their only escape was to become someone else. They would dress in the rough clothes of a common woman, sneak out of the palace through hidden servant tunnels, and disappear into the chaotic anonymity of the city streets, desperate for a single night of freedom. All of these practices, whether forced or chosen, paint a horrifying picture of a system where our modern concept of consent was completely meaningless. A person's body was not their own. It was a political tool, a vessel for royal bloodlines, or a plaything for a bored monarch. Ultimately, every body within the palace walls, from the lowest scullery maid to the queen herself, belonged to the crown. As we step back inside the royal bedchambers, we find they were often filled with more than just fine furniture and tapestries. Hidden away in locked chests and ornate boxes were strange collections of objects, items that mixed the sacred rituals of the church with the most private sexual acts in deeply unsettling ways. There are stories written in the private journals of ladies in waiting that tell of royal women using holy relics as tools for their own private pleasure. A small, smooth piece of a saint's bone or a carved ivory crucifix would be taken from its place of honor and used in ways that were never intended, blurring the line between prayer and arousal. Incredibly, this wasn't always seen as a sin by those who did it. They believed that by using the object in this intensely personal way, they were absorbing its spiritual power and holiness directly into their bodies. And the priests in the palace, they often chose a strategic silence. To accuse a powerful queen of blasphemy was a dangerous and potentially fatal career move, so they simply learned to look the other way. They also used parts of animals, which were believed to carry deep symbolic power. A fan made from the iridescent feathers of a peacock wasn't just for cooling the air, it was a tool for arousal that was thought to bestow the peacock's pride and beauty onto the user. Strips of shed snakeskin might be pressed against the body, not just for the texture, but to invoke the snake's symbolic connection to temptation and regeneration. There were even darker whispers, found scribbled in the margins of old medical texts, that hinted at even stranger practices. These unconfirmed rumors spoke of queens using small, live animals, like trained ferrets or rodents, for stimulation. While we can't prove these stories are true, the fact that they were even written down gives us a chilling glimpse into just how strange things could get behind closed doors. Much more common, however, was the use of specially carved objects made from smooth, polished ivory or animal bone, often shaped like male genitals. These weren't seen as crude toys, but as valuable and personal instruments for pleasure. They were stored carefully in locked chests, and were sometimes even passed down from one generation to the next, a bizarre and secret kind of family heirloom. This practice might seem shocking to us, but it actually came from much older, pre-Christian pagan traditions. In many ancient cultures, phallic symbols weren't seen as obscene at all. They were openly worshipped as powerful icons of fertility and the life-giving force of nature. The private habits of medieval royals were, in many ways, a hidden echo of these ancient beliefs. Because of this deep-rooted belief in fertility symbols, it wasn't uncommon to find large, waist-high stone phallic statues placed in the private rooms of princesses and queens. A young royal woman was taught from childhood that this was a sacred object. She was told to touch it and even press her body against it daily, believing that this physical contact would ensure she would be fertile and able to produce a male heir for the kingdom. But perhaps the darkest and most grotesque of all these rituals involved the use of sacrificed animal corpses. This practice, hidden in the deepest shadows of the court, was based on the terrifying belief that a person could absorb an animal's life force, its strength, or its fertility through sexual contact with its body in the moments just after it was killed. The participant, often a young prince or princess, would be led into a dark, incense-filled room where the freshly sacrificed animal lay on an altar. They would then be instructed to press their naked body against the still warm corpse, an act that to them was not a violation, but a sacred and necessary union with the spirit of nature. And in a final, chilling act of pure dominance, some kings would ritually urinate on their partners. This had nothing to do with pleasure. It was a symbolic act of marking someone as their territory, like an animal claiming its property. It was the ultimate and most humiliating expression of absolute ownership over another person's body. But it's important to remember that not all of these strange acts were forced. Some royals, both men and women, willingly explored the dynamics of power and pain. There are records of private rooms being built specifically for BDSM, secret chambers complete with velvet ropes, padded benches, and hooks on the walls where they could engage in consensual acts of domination and submission. For people who had to live every waking moment of their public lives as symbols of ultimate power and control, the act of surrendering that control in private could be a profound psychological release. To be tied up, to be ordered around, was to escape the crushing weight of the crown, if only for a few hours. Strange beliefs also controlled the most basic aspects of sex, especially when it came to family planning. In a desperate and misguided attempt to avoid an unwanted pregnancy, a queen might be forced into a painful and humiliating contorted position, such as being suspended upside down by her ankles, based on the superstitious belief that gravity would prevent conception. There was another position, known in some records as the crap crawl, which required a girl to arch her back on her hands and feet in a physically grueling pose. These weren't acts of passion or erotic techniques. They were bizarre and humiliating rituals, born from a complete and total ignorance of human biology and enforced through the unchallengeable power of a king. A king's personal obsessions could also turn the royal bedroom into a bizarre and unsettling stage. Some monarchs would force their wives, or any woman brought to their bed, to dress in the clothes of someone else. This wasn't just a simple request, it was a demand, and often the clothes belonged to a dead wife, a former lover, or most disturbingly, the king's own sister. This was far from a fun or consensual game of roleplay. It was a deeply disturbing act of psychological control. The king wasn't being intimate with the living, breathing person in front of him. He was using her body as a mannequin to dominate a memory, to relive a moment, or to possess someone who was long gone. The woman wearing the costume was effectively invisible. A woman might be forced to change costumes multiple times in a single night, a silent and humiliating performance. She would enter dressed as a pious nun, then be ordered behind a screen, only to emerge moments later in the rough dress of a peasant girl. With each change, her own identity was completely erased, turning her into a living doll for the king's private theatre. This strange practice required entire secret wardrobes, closets attached to the bedchamber, filled not with the current queen's clothing, but with a curated collection of costumes for these nightly performances. Seamstresses would be ordered to work in secret, meticulously recreating a specific gown from a memory or a portrait. The women involved were not partners, they were simply actors in a play scripted and directed by the king. When you put all of these pieces together, a clear picture begins to form. You see a world ruled not by reason, but by raw superstition and the whims of absolute power. Behind the high castle doors, any bizarre personal obsession could be elevated to the status of a sacred tradition, and any person, regardless of their rank, could be reduced to a tool. For a royal, this life of ritual and performance began the moment they were born and didn't end until long after they were dead. There was no private life, as we would understand it. Every private moment, from the bedroom to the birthing chamber, was controlled by centuries of tradition, superstition, and cold, hard politics. A royal marriage was never the fairy tale we read about. It was, at its core, a business deal. A princess was an asset, a piece of valuable property to be traded in exchange for land, peace treaties, or political alliances. Her own hopes and feelings were completely irrelevant to the transaction. After the grand wedding was over, many of these young women were left in complete and total isolation. Once the treaty was signed and her political purpose was served, she was often ignored by her new husband and left to live out her days in a remote wing of the palace, a lonely stranger in a foreign land. The very act of producing an heir was just as cold and robotic as the marriage contract itself. Many royal couples were expected to use a chastity sheet, a bizarre piece of linen with a single, perfectly cut hole in the middle. This allowed them to perform their marital duty without any unseemly intimacy or direct bodily contact. This wasn't about being modest or shy, it was about reinforcing the central idea that royal sex was for lineage, not for love. The sheet was a literal fabric barrier against any genuine human connection, ensuring that the act of procreation remained a sterile and dignified matter of state business. That same sheet was then often used as public proof. The morning after the wedding night, a group of ladies in waiting or court officials would come to inspect the linen for a blood stain. This turned a young bride's most private and vulnerable moment into a public spectacle, and a pass-fail test of her honor. The education of royal children was just as strange and, in many cases, deeply traumatic. To teach a young prince about his future duties as a husband and king, he was sometimes brought into his parents' darkened bedchamber and forced to stand in a corner and watch them have sex. It was considered a practical, if disturbing, part of his royal training. Meanwhile, while the boys were being taught to watch, the young princesses were being groomed for a life of submission. Many were married off as children, some before they had even turned 10 years old. Their futures traded away by their fathers for a favorable political alliance with a neighboring kingdom. Imagine being one of these little girls, sent far away from home and your family, your childhood cut brutally short. You would be handed over to a powerful, much older man you'd never met before, who was now your husband and, in the eyes of the law, your owner. Your body was now part of a diplomatic deal between powerful men, and while some of these child marriages were not consummated until the girl was physically mature, many were. These girls were often subjected to what can only be called child abuse, a profound trauma that was simply accepted by everyone as the unfortunate but necessary price of being born a princess. This life of ritual followed them all the way to the grave. Even a king's final moments were not his own, but were instead governed by one last, bizarre, and horrifying practice. In some courts, there was a tradition that can only be described as deathbed sex. The belief behind this was that a king's soul could not pass peacefully into the afterlife if his body was still weighed down by any unfulfilled earthly desires. Therefore, to ensure his soul could be free, he needed to have one final sexual release just before he died, a final cleansing of his mortal vessel. This led to the horrific situation where a terrified servant or a slave would be brought to the king's bedside as he was dying. She would then be forced to perform sexual acts on him, even if he was unconscious, unresponsive, or too weak to move. This final act of abuse was treated by the court as a sacred and necessary duty to ensure the king's peaceful passage into the next world. When you look at the whole picture, it's a chilling journey. From a cold, detached conception performed through a hole in a sheet, to a final, forced act at the moment of death. A royal's life was completely surrounded by bizarre, and often brutal, rituals that controlled their every private moment. In these courts, a royal wedding was never the happily ever after, at the end of a love story. For the woman involved, it was the beginning of a lifelong political contract, a set of duties and expectations from which there was almost never an escape. When it came time to choose a wife for a king or prince, her personality, her kindness, or her beauty were rarely the main concern. A princess was chosen for what she brought with her on paper. She was the living embodiment of her dowry, and that dowry consisted of lands, armies, trade agreements, and valuable political alliances that could change the map of a continent. Her value was calculated with the cold precision of an accountant reviewing a balance sheet. She wasn't a person, she was an asset. In the great and brutal Game of Thrones, a princess was one of the most valuable bargaining chips a king could play, a piece to be traded to secure a border, end a war, or unite two powerful houses against a common enemy. The wedding night itself was often just another performative act in this long political play. It wasn't about a new couple beginning their life together in a private, intimate moment. It was about producing concrete, and sometimes public, proof for the court that the deal had been sealed, the contract fulfilled, and the alliance physically consummated. For so many of these women, the rest of their lives would be spent in a state of profound and quiet loneliness. Once the wedding was over and the treaty was signed, they were often queens in name only, living in a separate wing of the palace with no real power and no companionship from the husband who now saw them as little more than a finished piece of business. They were left to fade away in a gilded prison. As we've seen, the consummation of the marriage was often a cold, witnessed duty, devoid of any romance or tenderness. Whether it was a room full of nobles watching the couple get into bed, or the use of a bizarre chastity sheet, the goal was the same. It was a legal requirement, not an expression of love, a final clause in a contract that had to be officially observed. After the wedding, a queen's life moved on to her next, and most important, job: childbirth. In an era with no modern medicine, this was the most dangerous task she would ever undertake. Her entire worth, her status, and even her safety at court rested on her ability to survive the ordeal and produce a healthy male heir to secure the dynasty. The royal birthing chamber was a room ruled by superstition. Astrologers would be consulted to determine the most auspicious time to conceive and to be born. Priests would stand in the corner chanting prayers, strange herbal potions would be forced upon the queen, and magical charms would be placed under the bed, all in a desperate attempt to influence fate and ensure the baby was a boy. If a queen failed in this duty, if she produced only daughters or was unable to conceive at all, she could lose everything. Depending on the king's temperament and the political situation, many were divorced and publicly shamed, sent away to live out their days in a remote convent, or, in the most ruthless courts, accused of a crime like treason or witchcraft and executed to make way for a new wife. Because of this immense pressure, the royal nursery was far from a place of simple, childish innocence. It was the epicenter of court intrigue and paranoia. There was a constant, nagging fear of poison or kidnapping by rival claimants to the throne, and the young heir was watched day and night, his every move scrutinized as a sign of the kingdom's future. This life of public performance followed a royal all the way to the grave. When a monarch died, the entire kingdom was plunged into a period of highly public and choreographed mourning. Every noble was expected to display the appropriate amount of grief, wearing black, attending ceremonies, and weeping on command. It was one final, somber performance. Even in the face of what might be a very real personal loss, the moment a king drew his last breath was also the most dangerous moment for the kingdom. His death created a sudden and terrifying power vacuum. There would be a frantic, tense race to secure the throne for his rightful heir before ambitious uncles, cousins, or powerful nobles could make their own move, a critical tipping point that could easily erupt into a bloody civil war. When you step back and look at it all, you see that the entire life of a royal was a performance. From their first breath to their last, they were actors on a grand stage, and the whole world was their audience. Their lines were written by tradition, their costumes were dictated by rank, and they were never, ever allowed to step out of character. All the gold and jewels in the world couldn't buy them what we value most. Personal happiness was a luxury that few of them could ever afford. The feelings of the individual were always secondary. Duty to the crown, to the nation, and to the bloodline always came first. There was simply no such thing as a private life. For a king or a queen in the way we understand it today, that concept is a modern invention. Their bodies belonged to the state for the purpose of producing heirs. Their choices belonged to their council for the purpose of making policy, and even their darkest secrets belonged to the court gossips. They were public property. In the end, a monarch was more than just a person. They were a living symbol, the physical embodiment of their entire kingdom. Their life had to follow a strict and often brutal script, one that had been written by generations of tradition long before they were ever born, because any perceived flaw in them was seen as a dangerous flaw in the nation itself. So, as we close the book on these strange and haunting stories, it becomes clear that the polished, noble image of royalty we see in paintings and history books hides a much darker, stranger, and more complex reality. The truth is often buried, but it's always there, waiting in the shadows. These practices, from the bizarre rituals to the brutal enforcement of duty, show us the raw, flawed, and deeply uncomfortable humanity that existed behind the crown. These were not mythical figures or monsters. They were people trapped in a monstrous and unforgiving system that warped their lives in unimaginable ways. What drove all of this? If you look closely, beneath all the power and politics, the one emotion you find again and again is fear. It was a world saturated in it. The fear of losing power, the fear of sickness, the fear of a rival dynasty, the fear of failing to produce a worthy heir, and the all-encompassing fear of God. But perhaps the most unsettling part of it all is the profound silence that surrounded these practices. The fact that an entire society, from the highest bishop to the lowest servant, could see these things happening, know they were strange or cruel, and yet collectively agree to call it normal, to call it tradition. That chilling, unspoken agreement was where the real power of the system lay. Thank you for joining me on this long journey into the shadows of the past. I hope these stories have been as fascinating for you as they have been for me. May your night be free of royal burdens, may your sleep be soft and peaceful, and may your dreams be untouched by the strange and haunting echoes of history. Good night.